Harold Nichols executed after 37 years. The Karen Pulley case, crime, final meal and words. On December 11, 2025, at 10:39 a.m., Harold Wayne Nichols took his final breath in the execution chamber at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee. He was 64 years old, one day shy of his 65th birthday. In his last moments, strapped to a gurney with an 4-line running into his arm, he uttered 6 sentences that would become his final legacy. But those words came 37 years too late for the family of Karen Pulley, the 20-year-old college student whose life he brutally ended on a September night in 1988. What led a man to spend nearly 4 decades on death row? What drove him to commit crimes so horrific that even he admitted he wouldn't have stopped without intervention? The story of Harold Nichols isn't just about one murder. It's about a 3-month reign of terror that left at least 8 women traumatized, 1 family destroyed, and a community forever changed. It's about a criminal justice system that took 37 years to deliver what many call justice, and what others call revenge. This is the complete story of the red-haired stranger, from his traumatic childhood to his final meal of beef brisket and coleslaw. But to understand how it came to this, we need to go back to where it all began, to a troubled boy born on New Year's Eve 1960 in Cleveland, Tennessee. Harold Wayne Nichols entered the world on December 31, 1960, into circumstances that would haunt him and his victims for decades. His parents, Mac Nichols and Nanny Lou, brought him into a household already fractured by poverty, religious extremism, and mental instability. The family lived in a cramped home where Harold shared a bedroom with his parents and older sister Deborah, while his paternal grandmother occupied the only other room. Mac Nichols ruled the household with an iron fist and twisted religious dogma. As members of the Church of God of Prophecy, the family was isolated. Mac forbade any visitors except fellow churchgoers. The walls of that house held secrets that would only emerge decades later in courtroom testimony. In June 1961, just months after Harold's birth, tragedy struck when Mac's sister Betty Sampley and her husband drowned during a family outing. It was an omen of the darkness that would define the Nichols family. Young Harold's childhood was marked by losses. His grandmother died in August 1966. By January 1971, when Harold was just 10 years old, his mother Nanny died of breast cancer. What happened next would shape the monster he would become. Left alone with his father and 13-year-old sister, Harold and Deborah endured months of physical and sexual abuse at Mac's hands. The abuse was so severe that church leaders eventually intervened, but not to help the children. Instead, they forced Mac into a deal, give up the children to an orphanage, and they'd cover up the abuse to avoid criminal charges. Harold and Deborah were sent to Tomlinson Children's Home, where they witnessed and experienced more abuse. Deborah escaped through marriage in May 1976, moving out of state and leaving her younger brother behind. In June 1977, when Harold was 17, he was returned to his father's custody. By then, Mac was drinking heavily, collecting disability benefits, and soliciting prostitutes. Harold began skipping classes at Kirkman Technical High School, roaming the streets at night, a pattern that would define his adult life. He graduated in August 1979 and struggled to find work. In November 1981, seeking escape, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. At Fort Riley in Kansas, he met a married woman, started an affair, and they had a daughter in November 1983. That same month, the Army discharged him for poor performance. Harold abandoned his young family and returned to Chattanooga in early 1984, presumably moving back in with his father and finding work at a local convenience store. For 4 years, Harold Nichols lived a double life. By day, he was a convenience store clerk and, by 1987, a married man. He'd wed a woman named Joanne. By night, he prowled the streets of Chattanooga, driven by what he would later describe as uncontrollable urges. Everything changed on September 30, 1988. That's when Harold Nichols stopped being just a troubled man and became a killer. Friday, September 30, 1988. The Brainerd neighborhood of Chattanooga was quiet that night, a working-class area where people knew their neighbors and felt safe. Karen Pulley, a 20-year-old student at Chattanooga State Community College, lived in a house with 2 female roommates. She was studying to become a paralegal, a bubbly young woman who'd recently finished Bible college and was looking forward to life's possibilities. She'd been excited about seeing her older sister Lizette and holding her niece for the first time. That meeting would never happen. Harold Nichols had been watching the house. He parked nearby and observed from outside, waiting, watching. When he saw one of Karen's roommates dress and leave, he made his move. Armed with a short length of 2x4 lumber, he found an entry point through a bathroom window and climbed inside. The house was dark and quiet as he moved through it, searching. He found Karen alone in her upstairs bedroom, asleep in her bed. What happened next is almost too brutal to describe, but it must be told to understand the scope of this crime. Nichols struck Karen in the head with the 2x4. The blow wasn't fatal, but it stunned her. He tore her undergarments from her body and violently raped her as she fought back, struggling against her attacker. The evidence would later show she fought hard. This was not a woman who gave up easily. After the rape, while Karen was still struggling, still fighting to survive, Nichols picked up that 2x4 again. He struck her in the head. Then again. And again. And again. Court documents would later describe the blows as delivered with great force. The medical examiner would testify that Karen suffered skull fractures and massive brain injuries. The amount of damage to her head and body was, in the medical examiner's words, astounding. When Nichols was done, he left Karen on the floor next to her bed, bleeding and unconscious. He took the murder weapon with him, that blood-stained 2x4, and disposed of it in a lot in East Ridge. Then he went home to his wife Joanne, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, one of Karen's roommates made the horrifying discovery. Karen was still alive, lying in a pool of blood on the floor. Emergency responders rushed her to the hospital, but the injuries were too severe. On October 1, 1988, Karen Pulley died, never having regained consciousness. She never got to hold her niece. She never got to become a paralegal. She never got to live the life she'd been planning. But here's what makes this case even more chilling. Karen Pulley wasn't Harold Nichols' only victim. She was just the first one who died. What police didn't know yet was that Nichols had no intention of stopping. The murder of Karen Pulley was the beginning of a 3-month crime spree that would terrorize Chattanooga. For 3 months after Karen Pulley's murder, investigators had no leads. No fingerprints matched anyone in the system. The video surveillance technology of 1988 was primitive. Serology evidence, what they had before modern DNA testing, couldn't definitively link anyone to the crime. The murder weapon was missing. Karen's killer had seemingly vanished into thin air. But Harold Nichols hadn't vanished. He was still out there, still prowling the streets at night. What he'd done to Karen had awakened something in him that he admitted he couldn't control. In December 1988, just 2 months after murdering Karen, Nichols raped multiple women in the Chattanooga area. On December 31, 1988, his 28th birthday, he attempted to rape another woman in the Tiftonia neighborhood. In January 1989, the attacks continued. The pattern was always the same. He'd roam the city at night, watch houses from outside, break in through windows, and assault vulnerable women in their own homes. Then came January 5, 1989, the day everything unraveled. East Ridge police arrested Nichols on unrelated charges stemming from some of these rapes. But the arrest came with an unexpected twist. A man named Chris Mull had tipped off police about Nichols. But because Mull was jealous of Nichols' relationship with Mull's boyfriend, Larry Kilgore, who happened to be Nichols' best friend. A love triangle would be what finally brought a serial rapist and murderer to justice. Once in custody, police began showing victims' photographs. At 5:20 p.m., one victim identified him. An hour later, another did. Then another. By 8 p.m., Chattanooga Police Detective Richard Heck decided to question Nichols about an unsolved murder, the killing of Karen Pulley. No one expected what happened next. Nichols confessed. On video, he laid out everything, the layout of Karen's house, his entry through the bathroom window, the details of the rape and murder, where he'd hidden the murder weapon. He described it all in disturbing detail. At one point during his confession to another rape, Nichols began laughing. When police asked why he found it funny, he said, "Well, it's not really funny what happened, But the whole thing is sort of funny. That chilling laughter was unmistakable on the video recording. At 1:20 a.m. on January 7, 1989, Nichols led detectives to an East Ridge lot and pointed out the exact location where he discarded the 2x4 he'd used to murder Karen. The weapon was recovered, physical evidence that corroborated his confession. On January 8, 1989, Nichols' wife Joan told police that her husband had confessed to her as well, admitting to the rapes and Karen's murder. The case that had seemed unsolvable was suddenly wrapped up with a bow, but only because Harold Nichols couldn't stop committing crimes and got caught. The prosecution moved forward with multiple indictments. Nichols faced charges for Karen Pulley's rape and murder, plus multiple counts of aggravated rape, attempted rape, and burglary involving at least 7 other women. On May 7, 1990, his trial began. The defense tried to suppress the videotaped confession, but when the court denied the request, Nichols changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to first-degree felony murder, aggravated rape, and first-degree burglary in Karen's case. The trial moved to the sentencing phase. The state sought the death penalty, bringing 2 aggravating circumstances. The murder occurred during the commission of a felony, and Nichols had previous convictions for violent felonies. Prosecutors presented the videotaped confession, medical examiner testimony about Karen's injuries, and evidence of Nichols' 5 prior rape convictions. The defense tried to present mitigating factors: Nichols' cooperation, his good behavior in custody, his traumatic childhood. His wife Joan testified for him. His best friend Larry Kilgore took the stand. A local reverend claimed Nichols had been under the influence of an evil spirit. But then came the most damning testimony of all. Both Nichols himself and a psychiatrist admitted that if released, Nichols would continue to roam and rape. "I just get these feelings and I do it," Nichols told the jury. "I can't describe it or understand it." He tearfully added, "If I could trade places with Karen Pulley, I would." But the jury had heard enough. For all his crimes combined, Nichols received more than 200 years for the rape and burglary charges, and death for murder. In July 1990, the Hamilton County jury sentenced Harold Wayne Nichols to die. Harold "Red" Nichols, nicknamed for his distinctive red hair, would spend the next 35 years on Tennessee's death row. For perspective, that's longer than many people's entire careers. Children born the year he was sentenced would have their own children by the time his execution date finally arrived. Life on death row at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution follows a rigid, dehumanizing routine. Death row inmates are typically confined to their cells 23 hours a day. 1 hour for recreation, usually alone. Meals delivered through a slot in the door. No physical contact with visitors. Conversations happen through glass via telephone. Every interaction is documented, monitored, controlled. But Nichols wasn't idle during those decades. He filed appeal after appeal, as is every death row inmate's right. In May 2003, he filed for habeas corpus in federal court. A psychiatrist diagnosed him with intermittent explosive disorder, the same diagnosis given during his original trial, and documented mental health issues stemming from his traumatic childhood of abuse. The psychiatric evaluation painted a picture of a man whose capacity for violence was rooted in profound trauma, but that didn't change what he'd done. In October 2005, DNA testing finally caught up to the case. The new technology proved definitively that Nichols' sperm was present in Karen Pulley's body. His defense team withdrew their claim of innocence regarding the murder charge. There was no longer any doubt, if there ever had been. More appeals followed over the years, with Nichols' attorneys arguing ineffective counsel and emphasizing his cooperation with police through his confessions. Every appeal was denied. In June 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court denied another habeas corpus petition, and Tennessee set an execution date for August 2020. But then COVID-19 changed everything. In July 2020, Governor Bill Lee granted Nichols a stay of execution due to the pandemic's challenges and disruptions. At that time, Nichols had chosen to die in the electric chair, an option available to Tennessee inmates convicted of crimes before January 1999. It seemed he might actually prefer that method to lethal injection. Why the preference for electrocution? because Tennessee's lethal injection protocol at the time used a 3-drug combination that had caused problems. In 2022, those problems came to light when it was revealed that none of the drugs prepared for the 7 inmates executed in Tennessee since 2018 had been properly tested. Governor Lee paused all executions and ordered an independent investigation. Nichols received another stay, this time in June 2022, while Tennessee revised its lethal injection protocol. The new protocol, approved in December 2024, uses a single drug, pentobarbital. It's the same drug used to euthanize animals, and in high doses, it causes death by stopping breathing and heart function. In March 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court set a new execution date, December 11, 2025. Nichols was given a deadline to choose his execution method, electric chair or lethal injection. He refused to choose. His attorney Stephen Farrell explained that the Tennessee Department of Correction hadn't provided enough information about the lethal injection protocol for Nichols to make an informed decision. When the deadline passed in November 2025, lethal injection became his method by default. Right up until the end, Nichols' attorneys fought. They sued the state for allegedly violating Public Records Acts, seeking disclosure of the execution protocol. A Knox County judge granted their request on December 9, 2025, just 2 days before the execution. They petitioned Governor Lee to commute the sentence to life without parole, noting that Nichols would be the first person executed in Tennessee for a crime he pleaded guilty to since the state reenacted the death penalty in 1978. On December 9, Governor Lee formally denied clemency. Meanwhile, the victim's family prepared for the moment they'd been waiting 37 years to see. Karen's sister, Lizette Monroe, told reporters the wait had been 37 years of hell. She described Karen as gentle, sweet, and innocent, and said she hoped the execution would allow the family to finally focus on happy memories instead of the murder. Monroe traveled from Washington State to Nashville to witness the execution but canceled at the last minute. It was just too emotionally difficult. In his final weeks, Nichols experienced something almost like community. On Thanksgiving 2024, fellow death row inmates shared a meal with him before he was moved to death watch. As one reverend who witnessed it described, handshakes became brief embraces, rare in a maximum security environment. No one said goodbye. They offered words of gratitude instead. Then Nichols walked back to his cell, the sound of his footsteps on concrete echoing through the corridor, soft steps that carried more weight than any declaration could. In the days before his execution, Harold Nichols made his final choices, decisions that would define how the world remembered his last moments. He selected his last meal, beef brisket, coleslaw, a baked potato, onion rings, deviled eggs, and cheese biscuits with fruit tea. It was a simple Southern comfort food meal, the kind of food you'd get at a family barbecue, not on death row. Tennessee death row inmates get $20 toward their final meal. Nichols would be delivered the night before his execution and had to be consumed by midnight according to protocol. He also recorded a video message where he discussed a conversation that had profoundly affected him. The day that I was sentenced, there was a woman who stood up and said, "Can I get a chance to speak with him, face to face?" Nichols explained. It was Karen Pulley's mother. And we went to the jury room. Just me and her. She told me, "I forgive you cause I don't want to carry that with me." That moment of forgiveness from the mother of the woman he'd murdered reportedly changed Nichols. His spiritual advisor, J.R. Davis, who had known him for a decade through a prison men's group, believed Nichols' remorse and spiritual transformation were genuine. Davis would be with Nichols in the execution chamber when the time came. But forgiveness from one person doesn't mean justice denied for everyone else. Karen's family still wanted to see the sentence carried out. Jeff Monroe, Karen's brother-in-law, speaking on behalf of his wife Lizette, was clear, "We have waited 37 years for justice. The victims, and there were many, were carefully stalked and attacked. The crimes, and there were many, were deliberate, violent, and horrific. The execution raised questions about Tennessee's death penalty procedures that remain unanswered." Attorneys for death row inmates had sued over the new lethal injection protocol, arguing the state hadn't been transparent about how the drugs are obtained, tested, and administered. During Tennessee's previous execution in August 2024, inmate Byron Black said he was hurting so bad in his final moments, raising concerns about whether the protocol causes unnecessary suffering. A trial examining these concerns wasn't scheduled until April 2026, 4 months after Nichols' execution. The courts had essentially said, "We'll figure out if this method is constitutional, but we're going to keep using it in the meantime." There's also the broader context. Including Nichols, 46 men died by court-ordered execution in the U.S. in 2025. Tennessee had become one of the most active death penalty states, with 4 more executions already scheduled for 2026. The death penalty machinery, which had slowed to a crawl in many states, was accelerating in Tennessee. December 11, 2025. At 10 a.m., Harold Wayne Nichols was led into the execution chamber at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. He was 1 day away from his 65th birthday. Media witnesses described the scene. Nichols was strapped to a gurney, a sheet pulled up to just above his waist. A long tube ran from an IV pump to an insertion site on the inside of his elbow. His spiritual advisor, J.R. Davis, stood near him. The room was small, sterile, designed for one purpose. Outside, 2 groups had gathered, pro-death penalty advocates on one side, anti-death penalty demonstrators on the other. Inside the prison, in separate viewing areas, were Karen Pulley's family members and media witnesses who would document Nichols' final moments. Davis began speaking to Nichols, reciting scripture. They prayed together, reciting the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Their voices strained with emotion. Then the Lord's Prayer, "Our Father, who art in heaven." Both men were crying. Nichols nodded along as Davis continued speaking quietly to him, offering comfort in the face of death. Then came Nichols' final statement. His voice was clear, deliberate. "To the people I've harmed, I'm sorry," he said. "To my family, know that I love you. I know where I'm going to. I'm ready to go home." After the final "Amen," the execution team began the process. The pentobarbital began flowing through the 4-line into Nichols' bloodstream. Witnesses described what happened next. Nichols sighed. He groaned. His breathing quickened. His skin gradually changed color as the drug took effect. Pentobarbital is a barbiturate that depresses the central nervous system. In the doses used for execution, it causes unconsciousness within seconds, stops breathing within minutes, and causes cardiac arrest shortly after. At 10:39 a.m., Harold Wayne Nichols was pronounced dead. The time was significant. It was the same morning hour when Karen Pulley had been found dying on her bedroom floor 37 years earlier. After the execution, Karen Pulley's brother-in-law Jeff Monroe stood before cameras with a photograph of Karen, forever young, forever 20 years old. "Our family was destroyed by evil that night in September 1988, when Karen was raped and violently beaten to death in her own bedroom," he said. "Left to die alone, terribly injured, broken, bleeding and terrified." He continued, "Taking a life is serious and we take no pleasure in it. However, the victims, and there were many, were carefully stalked and attacked. The crimes, and there were many, were deliberate, violent, and horrific." The family, Monroe said, was relieved the nightmare was over and took comfort knowing Nichols could never harm anyone again. Karen's family would add one final statement. "Karen was an angel on loan from heaven, and she should not have been taken away in this brutal, violent way." Debbie Drew, Nichols' attorney, also spoke after the execution. She noted that her client had turned his life over to God after that conversation with Karen's mother decades ago. The spiritual advisor J.R. Davis said Nichols committed horrible crimes. But killing to teach people not to kill just doesn't make sense. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, redemption, and punishment. Harold Nichols experienced horrific abuse as a child, abuse that clearly contributed to his capacity for violence. He cooperated with police, pleaded guilty, expressed remorse, and reportedly underwent a genuine spiritual transformation. Does any of that matter when weighed against the life of Karen Pulley and the trauma of his other victims? The psychiatric experts said Nichols would have continued his violent crimes if not arrested. He himself admitted he couldn't control the urges. Does a death sentence 37 years after the crime serve justice? Or is it merely state-sanctioned revenge? Lizette Monroe, Karen's sister, didn't witness the execution because it was too emotionally difficult. Did 37 years of waiting for this moment provide healing, or did it just prolong the trauma? Tennessee's death penalty system raises its own questions. Why did it take 37 years to carry out this sentence? Between delays, appeals, stays for the pandemic, stays for protocol problems, and the years spent in legal limbo, is that justice delayed or justice denied? The state's new lethal injection protocol uses a single drug that veterinarians use to euthanize animals. One previous inmate said he was hurting so bad during execution with this drug. Are we certain this method is humane? Here's what we know for certain. On September 30th, 1988, Karen Pulley was a 20-year-old college student with dreams of becoming a paralegal. She was bubbly, happy, selfless. She just finished Bible college and was excited about her future. Harold Nichols took all of that away in one night of unthinkable violence. 7 other women in Chattanooga survived their attacks but carry the trauma to this day. One victim's family member told reporters in 2021 that the case continues to take a toll decades later. The ripple effects of Harold Nichols' 3-month crime spree touched dozens of lives. Families destroyed, innocence shattered, a community's sense of safety violated. Both of Karen's parents died before seeing Nichols executed. They lived the rest of their lives knowing their daughter's killer was alive while she was gone. Lizette Monroe, Karen's sister who was 17 at the time of the murder, described the 37 years as hell. "I'll be honest with you," she said, "neither one of my parents were ever the same after Karen's murder." The question this case leaves us with is difficult. In a justice system that took 37 years to execute a man who pleaded guilty, who admitted he would have continued his crimes, who showed remorse but couldn't undo what he'd done, did anyone truly win? Karen Pulley is still dead. Harold Nichols is now dead. 2 families have endured decades of grief. The system spent millions of dollars on legal proceedings. And tomorrow, Tennessee has 4 more executions scheduled for 2026. This is the reality of true crime. It's not entertainment. It's not a puzzle to solve. It's real people whose lives were destroyed by violence and a system that struggles to respond to that violence in a way that brings healing to anyone. I cover cases like this every week, cases that expose the failures and complexities of our criminal justice system, cases where the lines between victim and perpetrator aren't always clear, cases that force us to confront difficult questions about punishment and redemption. If you want to understand how the system really works, beyond the headlines and sound bites, subscribe to this channel. Next week, I'll be covering another death penalty case that raises even more troubling questions about how we decide who lives and who dies. You won't want to miss it. What do you think? Did justice prevail in the Harold Nichols case, or did the system fail everyone involved? Should someone who pleaded guilty, cooperated fully, and underwent spiritual transformation still face execution? And what about the 37-year wait? Is that justice, or is it cruelty to both the criminal and the victim's families? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. Remember, these are real people, real families, real grief. Handle these stories with the weight they deserve.